Our word comes from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 3, verses 21 through 31, but I'm going to start at 20, take liturgist license here. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came from Christ Jesus. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. Because of what law? The law that requires works? No, because of the law that requires faith. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too. Since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith. Do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. This is the word of the Lord for the people of God.
We're going to be doing some Old Testament, and it should feel pretty hot in here. All right, so most of you know I went to an Episcopal, then an Anglican, and then a Catholic school. So when I was off at boarding school, I got it hammered into me all the time. And when I went home, I lived in a place in Georgia that was in the middle of nowhere. I mean nowhere. It was a dirt road, if you can imagine that, 8 miles long, and there were 7 families that lived on it. And we were 2.5 miles into that dirt road. Right? You wouldn't think you would know your 7 neighbors, but believe it or not, we shared the same phone. We had a party line, so that when you picked up the phone, kids, this is hard to believe, but when you picked up the phone, Mrs. Pileggi was usually on the other end talking to someone else on the street. So we got to know our neighbors because we shared a phone. It is unbelievable. My father was a doctor, so we didn't share the phone very long, but oftentimes I would pick up the phone and ask Miss Pileggi how long she was going to be on, because my daddy needed the phone. Excuse me? Yeah, it was faultless. It wasn't like I was raised with a dirt floor. It wasn't like that, but it was just a different time. Mr. Pileggi, Mrs. Pileggi's husband, was very Catholic, as was that entire family. By the end, there were 9 of them. There were 8 of us, because we too were Catholic. And Mr. Pileggi, he loved revivals. He loved revivals. And at that time in Georgia, you could not throw a stick without hitting a revival. A huge tent in a field. And sometimes that tent had been there so long that all the grass was dead. It had become hard clay, and there was always hay thrown out on it. You know, it was incredible for a 7, 8-year-old to sit there and watch that. You know, Mr. Pileggi, he didn't really take part. He just sort of hung back and watched what was going on. Sometimes it was so amazing. Every pastor, every preacher had something a little different, but many had the ability to bang on their Bible and you would feel the nails being driven into Jesus. It was unbelievable. Each one of them had that ability to drive home that fear and guilt that was in everybody at that time. The one thing they all had in common was that assurance of pardon at the end, that Christians, in fact, would be pardoned. And today, that revivalist theology, still out there, believes that you not only have to change your mind in order to accept Jesus, but you have to be reborn in your heart. Your heart has to have birth, and you need to accept Jesus into your heart. Now you're sitting out there wondering, why on earth am I telling you this? Why am I going through this? Because it brings us to kind of our title here, The Awakening. Are we awake? 1730, one of the most famous sermons of all time, modern sermons, and that's kind of loose because it is 300 years ago that it was delivered. But Jonathan Edwards delivered a sermon called basically Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. All Old Testament, most of it. And most of it filled with fear, guilt. God was holding us over a fire like a spider on a string. He was ready to drop us into that fire because of the loathing that he had for us. I personally have really not read that Bible. You know, I have, but I look at it through the lens of Jesus. I don't think that particular sermon is through the lens of Jesus. It's through the lens of fear, so that he could get people to do the things that he needed them to do. Today, we look at the Bible as being the history of God with us. Our history of God, the Old Testament. The New Testament is our relationship with God through Jesus. The relationship of God through Jesus. So if we look at the Old Testament, if you look at the Old Testament, in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, God's anger is mentioned 27 times in the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. 27 times. In the remainder of the Old Testament, 152 times. God is very angry in the Old Testament. If you think about some of the things that were done by God in the Old Testament, and if we're only looking at the Old Testament, we truly are in trouble. We as a people are in trouble. All right, now I don't mean to simplify sort of our relationship, but I kind of look at it as my relationship with my earthly father. My earthly father, great man, did a lot of cool things. His sort of teaching style was a bit aggressive. I mean, it really didn't do much for me, but it was very aggressive. He was incredibly angry in my mind. I never understood what he was trying to say to me. I didn't understand it. All it was anger being thrown at me and violence and whatnot. It wasn't for years before he and I got a relationship together. You know, kind of Old Testament versus New Testament. Angry God, not so angry God, a forgiving, loving God. I'm just going to sit and listen. Is that your baby again? All right. Well, that doesn't count. Only the real double. So here we are. Why did I choose what we chose, what Miss Sue read for our liturgy today? Well, that's pretty much the first time that Paul tells the Romans, hey, wait, I know I've been telling you a lot of bad stuff, some of which comes out of the Old Testament, but really, there's some good news here. That although we're all sinners, that we can be redeemed. We can, in fact, be accepted by God. We're still going to be judged by God, but we will, in fact, be accepted by God. All right, so what gets us here? That anger. Can we as Christians be angry? Can we be? Yeah. I mean, yes, we can. No, we can't. I mean, and Paul pretty much talks about that right before he gets to there in Romans 3:21, and in this case 20, because she backed up one on me. But that 21 through 31 is great. Before that, he is saying, you know, we are all sinners. We all sin no matter what. And sadly, because we're all sinners, we all get thrown into the same pile. That no matter how righteous you are and how horrible that guy is, we in fact are all thrown in the same box at the end. We're all judged for the sins that we have. We will all be judged for those in that same box. Did Jesus get angry? And if we get angry, what happens? We're likely to sin when we get angry. I mean, either really bad, I mean, you can get angry enough that you'd murder somebody, and that would be really right up to the top there. Or, I mean, what are the main reasons that we get angry? I mean, injustice, that's one that if you don't get angry at injustice, you probably should. Jealousy, fear, hate, all of those. Bad drivers. All right, so bad drivers is the one I'm going to pull out first because, you know, we shouldn't take the Lord's name in vain. And although when you're driving down the street, you might not scream out the Lord's name in vain, but whatever it is that comes out of your mouth as that person from Ohio goes by you on the highway, whatever it is that you say is actually the intent, not what you're saying. It's not taking the Lord's name in vain, it's the intent of taking the Lord's name in vain. So keep that in mind as you're driving down the street. Let them go. I need to say that. I need to say it because I'm the worst. So here we go. Did Jesus get angry? Jesus, the most perfect of all of us. Did Jesus get angry? The other day at a baseball game, I had a discussion with someone that is now sitting in this room. And he argued that when Jesus got angry at Temple, turning over the money exchangers, he actually wasn't angry. He did that for a purpose, to start a ball rolling that had one destination in mind, and that was the cross. That was why he got angry. I would argue that he not only got angry there in a way, he got angry at the religious leaders that were cold-hearted. He got angry at the injustice that he saw, but he didn't sin. And that's the most important thing. We can get angry. Let's not just take it so far that we sin. So now, I'm going to back up real quick and look at Edward's, those sinners in the hands of an angry God, and think, gosh, there's a lot that goes towards us being saved. A lot. And you can say so many places throughout the Bible where Jesus and God want to save us, want us to be there. And I'm going to say that my favorite, whenever I question the things that I have done in this world, I think of Luke 23:34. And that is one of Jesus's last earthly words on the cross. And he says, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." And that is so important because we know not what we do. Even if we know what is good and bad, if you were here last week, you're well on your way to knowing the difference between good and bad, a super sermon. But that doesn't make us moral. That doesn't make us any less sinful. We just know better. And knowing the outcome of our sin doesn't seem to stop us from sinning. But know that Jesus is there for us, to enter us, and to help us be better people. Amen? Amen.